There. As we're all aware, ESG is an important topic and hot topic for investors, regulators, boards, corporate governance professionals. And I think it's going to be very helpful to all of us to hear from our panelists today about this important topic, and also actionable and practical steps that we all can think about implementing within our own companies. So I wanted to take a moment to introduce our moderator, Stephen Ferrollo, who will then introduce our panelists. Stephen is a partner at Perkins Coie, where he focuses on a variety of corporate matters. And his long and esteemed career also includes serving as the Dean of the University of San Diego Law School, where he was also a professor of law in business, corporate law, contracts, and securities regulation. Stephen also focuses on the life sciences industry and currently serves as Vice President and Secretary on the Board of Directors of Biocom. So with that, I'll turn it to you, Stephen, to introduce the rest of the panelists and our panel for today.
Thank you, Jennifer. It's a pleasure to be part of this ACC webinar program. And I do want to say that for several years while I was the dean, I oversaw a course on in-house counseling at the law school that was sponsored by ACC San Diego, and that had many members of this chapter who taught in the course, led by Steve Spector and Dennis Stryker, and including Mike Ryder and also Sarah's predecessor, Brian Calloway. So I want to thank ACC San Diego for all that they do for our community, to educate in-house counsel as well as to educate students. I'm going to be very, very brief in my introduction of the topic and speakers. As Jennifer said, you know, ESG issues have become front and center in corporate boardrooms and in the news. No longer just matters of concern to a few institutional investors or, you know, the prospects of pending regulatory mandates. There's growing recognition that ESG issues present competitive advantages for companies that seek to be leaders in their industries. In any case, there's a need for all companies to have actionable plans, policies, and clear goals and metrics. And our five speakers are all actively involved in developing and implementing those plans and policies and tracking those metrics and goals. We have two, if you, the next slide, two experienced general counsel, Sarah Kim, Vice President, General Counsel and Corporate Secretary and Chief Ethics Officer of Callaway Gulf. Mike Ryder, who was once at Callaway Gulf, which is over the moment, now Senior Vice President, Deputy General Counsel, Legal Business Partner, Sleep and Respiratory Care at ResMed. And then we have three of the leaders of Perkins Coie's ESG advisory team. We have Allison Handy, who's also co-chairs the firm-wide corporate and securities practice. Paul Hirose, who's senior counsel and co-chairs firm-wide supply chain compliance, corporate and social responsibility practice, and Kevin Feldis, who heads the white collar and investigation practice here in California. And I'm going to ask Kevin to start and to give us an overview of recent developments in ESG. Kevin?
Great. Hey, thanks, Stephen, and nice to see everybody. It is now widely recognized, as you mentioned, that corporations have more than just an economic imperative to focus on the environmental, social, and governance issues that impact corporations. If there was ever any doubt that the landscape has really shifted, just consider three big stories from the last week or two involving big oil corporations. So we heard that Exxon lost a proxy battle where three new independent directors have been appointed, largely based on climate and ESG issues. Shell lost a lawsuit in the Netherlands in which they are going to now be responsible for reducing emissions to a far greater extent than originally planned. And Chevron, also in the last week or so, the shareholders voted to further reduce Scope 3 emissions. And for those of you, and I'm sure everybody on the call does know, Scope 3 emissions are indirect emissions emissions. So pretty significant developments that really tell us the landscape has shifted. So most of the clients we work with, already take ESG as part of one of their core corporate values, but everybody's at a different place in this ESG journey. We all know that the key stakeholders are demanding action and with an increasing pace, and those three stories I just related are indicative of that. So it's obviously shareholders, but it's our own employees. It are the consumers, and again, and as we'll hear about later, it's going to be the investors as well. So let me just talk about a couple of things here in the next just few minutes before we lead on to our other speakers. I want to just reference the metrics that are being used. I want to talk about a framework for considering where you are in ESG and how you can move forward. And then just a few new developments that everyone should be aware of. So I think most people know that in 2020, the International Business Council of the World Economic Forum kind of combined with the big four firms and created these ESG metrics that can be divided into four categories: principles of governance, the planet, the people, and prosperity. Now, there are many standards out there that folks use, and there are many private rating agencies, but there is an effort to try to unify around some common standards, and this is really what the IBC did. So what's the point of these metrics? Well, it's to help companies align their corporate values and strategies along a certain common metric, really very much based on those UN SDGs that were put out, if you believe it or not, in 2015. So a number of years ago, even though now we're really focusing on them. And we're really seeing that it's more than just, this isn't just a governmental issue. I mean, we're here because this is an issue for corporations and businesses to focus on. And everyone's realizing that by following these metrics, we can build value. Stephen, as you said, we can build value and be more viable in the long term. And by defining a common set of metrics, we can compare ourselves against ourselves and ourselves against our competitors. So these IBC metrics really encourage companies to report against a set of 21 core metrics, but of course there are many subparts. There's going to be some that are more or less material for any individual business. And even if you haven't really done a lot in a certain area, it's still important to address it, even if it's a sort of address and report why or where you are on that issue rather than just leave it out already. And we can talk more about that. But let me just touch on what I see, and I know that a lot of us talk to our clients about, is what kind of framework is useful. And here I think we've got a graphic for this, Elizabeth, if you could pop this up. So looking at this graphic, it should be a couple of slides forward. It seems basic, but I found it really useful. The assess where you currently are, and what are your biggest challenges? What additional information do you need? Next, define where you want to be. What are your goals? What are your initial priorities? And again, you may be way ahead of the curve, or you may be starting this journey, and it's important to be realistic. And you don't need to do it all right out of the gate. Figure out what expertise you need and develop your own roadmap and timeframe, but be realistic about it. Then, of course, implementation. I mean, this sounds basic, but it's really important that you commit to not just creating a great plan, but that it's put forth with gusto. And then it's very a senior level, just like many of us on this call are familiar with. Any compliance issue, it's really got to be at the senior level, and it's got to be substance. And of course, measure. This is really critical. How are we doing? How are you doing against what you've set out your own goals are going to be? Now, it's important about these rating entities and outside entities who will also be measuring, but you should be defining this issue for yourself more so than letting others to define it for you. And that's another reason to get out in front of this. So you're setting the tone. And finally, you're going to be reporting out honestly with full transparency, explain where you are and where you want to be, and repeat. So I know this seems very straightforward, but it's also can be useful, and you can tailor this and obviously fill in the bullet points that are most material to your business enterprise. Finally, I want to touch on, and we can go ahead and put down the slide, I just want to touch on a few, recent developments. Look, it's clear now that folks realize that this long-term value can be created. Investors are looking for this. As I said before, our stakeholders are looking for our commitment to ESG. But also the SEC, as you all know, announced in March that they're creating a climate and ESG task force within the Division of Enforcement. Now, primarily, and at least initially, they'll likely be looking at reporting for public companies, obviously, to make sure that the reporting is accurate. That makes sense, and that's sort of a first step here. It's no longer just report because it sounds good. It's got to be report because investors are relying on this to measure the value of your company. I also wanted to just quickly mention, just looking at other developments, because this is a worldwide issue. The UK recently announced its intention to make the TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, mandatory for a broad range of UK companies. So that's obviously significant. And the International Accounting Standards Board proposed to update one of the IFRS standards, really to show that we need to include ESG metrics in order for folks to be able to fully evaluate the finances in the context of environmental, social, and governance issues. There's a lot more we could point to that's going on. As you all know, you just pick up the paper, it's going to be on the front page. But I wanted to highlight that for you. And Stephen, I think we've got a lot of other things to cover here. So
thank you, Kevin. Thanks for providing that context and overview. And now I'm going to ask, let's just get down to the ground level and ask our two GCs to talk about where they see their companies in this scheme that Kevin has talked about, and their roles in developing and implementing ESG policies. Mike, you want to start?
Sure, I'm happy to. And let me start by saying thank you to the Perkins Coie team for inviting a litigator to a purely corporate exercise. I don't get that opportunity very often. And the reason that Stephen invited me is because I support the audit committee at ResMed. And ESG is absolutely on the radar of the audit committee and on our board of directors. And I think, we, like a lot of companies, have transitioned from the point of ESG being a check the box kind of an exercise that companies go through, to really looking at it as an opportunity to tell our story. We have a very good story with respect to our environmental issues. Our compliance issues are now absolutely top notch and have been for a long time. It's part of our DNA. And really what we're now trying to do is define what defines best in class for companies like ResMed and other companies in the medical device industry, because we see ESG as a potential for a competitive advantage. We're doing so many things right. We're looking for an opportunity to tell our story in a compliant way and demonstrate the kinds of things that ResMed does day in and day out that are now becoming so very important to our shareholders, our employees, and other stakeholders, including our board of directors. Thanks, Stephen. Back to you.
Thank you, Mike. Sarah, how about you and Callaway?
Sure. Thank you for that. And same here as well. Thank you for inviting me to this panel. So for us, the journey has been fairly interesting and very robust in the last couple of years. When I first joined Callaway, which was about 2.5 years ago, I would say that's right around the time when, as a public company, we've always been very good with our governance and even from the kind of the outsider's perspective, like a proxy advisory firm like ISS, making sure that we score well and we reflect accurately what our corporate governance practices has been, and reflecting that we have a very polished process with regards to governance. Right around that time, I think a little before I joined Callaway, ISS started measuring public companies on environmental and social matters as well. And it was a little bit of an eye-opening experience because we had thought that we were doing a very good job of having internal processes in place relating to environmental and social topics. When these scores and kind of outside measuring processes started coming out a few years ago, that's I think when we realized, we're scoring low on these points for some of the sub pillars being as low as kind of the bottom of the score. So it allowed us to have the opportunity to kind of really reflect and start assessing what is the company doing. We are doing all these great things. One of the things is that we're not being vocal about it. We're not being transparent about it. And I think when it comes to ESG efforts for a lot of companies, that's a part of the puzzle that comes with the package, which is that in your company, you may already be doing a lot of really great things and having great processes in place. But part of this exercise, what we've learned is that it's also making sure that it's relatable, and you can share what you're doing with the rest of the industry and your consumers and your employees, and making your process more transparent. So, in an effort to do that for Callaway, we started the journey of looking into things like, well, how can we start improving our ISS score based on our current processes, which naturally led to establishing and launching a formalized sustainability initiative and a committee that goes with that, so that we can have a holistic global approach to how the company looks at it from both the headquarters and the subsidiary level. And by establishing a process in place like that and bringing all of the key stakeholders in place, it kind of unified the process, it streamlined it, and then now we have more of a defined way of how we're approaching environment and social topics, which I think is really important. It can't be done overnight, but just starting with kind of the eye-opening experience of having the industry start reflecting what is important, that they want to know more about the company, that led us into digging deeper into what our current processes are, and then now defining what we want to focus on and invest for future as well. So that's kind of been our journey, and I can certainly go into more details as we go through the call, but that's it for now.
Yeah, so I'd asked Sarah and Mike just to give an overview of where they are in the process. We're going to delve more deeply into some of the initiatives and things they're doing in their respective companies in just a few minutes. Meanwhile, before moving on, I want to invite you to raise questions. Any questions you have for any of our panelists, or you want to ask generally, just use the chat room. And so I will track the chat, and then after a couple more presentations, we'll then get a chance to answer your questions, as well as get the panel involved in a more free-flowing discussions of some of these issues. So please don't hesitate to pose any questions you might have to any or all of our panelists. With that, I'm going to ask Allison to talk about ESG disclosure and reporting issues. Allison.
Thanks, Stephen. Yeah, I think so. I will start from the perspective of sort of the public company thinking about SEC reporting, and then also disclosures outside of SEC reports. So I'll start by just highlighting a couple of sort of rulemaking areas that we're seeing. We heard from Kevin some of the sort of broader frameworks that are being, established out there, and things that companies can start thinking about as they start thinking about ESG reporting. But sort of more on the more granular level for US public companies and SEC requirements, this last year was the first year that the new topic of human capital management was part of the SEC disclosure requirements. And so we saw in 10Ks filed this last year, companies starting to, the rule was only passed in November. So there wasn't a whole lot of time for companies to start figuring out, what are we going to do? What are we going to say about human capital management in our 10K? So We did see companies start to put out, disclosures. It was a lot more qualitative, not too much in the terms of quantitative metrics that came out this last year. And so coming out of that, what companies have heard, and I think it was about a month or two ago, new SEC Chair Gensler said in a speech that the SEC might do more rulemaking in this area and might come out with specific disclosure metrics, that are going to be required for human capital management. And so I think that, along with the announcement from the SEC a few months ago, requesting input from, comments from the public on potential for climate change disclosure requirements, I think what this is all signaling is we are likely to see the SEC start doing more specific rulemaking and calling for more specifics on, metrics and quantitative disclosures for companies. So that's not, we're not there yet, but I think what we are hearing from the SEC is it's likely to start happening in the next year or so. So, companies, to the extent you're not doing it already, companies might expect that that kind of rulemaking is coming down the pipe. For now, as Kevin sort of introduced and both Mike and Sarah talked about, companies should be thinking about this from their own perspective. What are you already doing? What makes sense for your company? What are the goals you want to set and the things that you want to work toward? But another part of that, and I think Kevin made a great point. That's what's most important, thinking about it from internally from your own company. But as part of that process, one piece might be looking, both as Sarah mentioned, looking at those rankings and those ratings that are out there. How can you better report to get the credit for what you're already doing? And then also talking to investors and looking at your peers. What are the topics that peers are reporting on? And what are your investors asking you for? A lot of institutional investors, they might be thinking about certain topics, certain issues, wanting to be able to compare across their portfolio companies, or report something in an aggregated basis. And so talking to investors and looking at peers, you might be able to figure out, okay, what are the areas, what are the particular topics and metrics we might consider reporting on, see if we're able to do that. And one other data point that I just highly recommend for companies getting started in this is SASB. The SASB industry guides, SASB came out with, I think it was in 2016, 2017, start putting out these industry guides. So you can go figure out, okay, for our industry, they've already kind of done that homework, that legwork for you to figure out what are the particular topics in ESG and sustainability, or areas, potentially even metrics that you might want to report on. So for those companies that are just getting started, I highly recommend taking a look at the SASB industry guides. I'll make just one other point here. Well, I guess two other points. So first, and I think Sarah was getting at this with her comments, you only get credit for what you report. And so it doesn't have to go into the 10K. Yes, the SEC is starting to make rules, human capital management disclosures need to be in the 10K, but for a company that, says, okay, well, we want people to know what we're doing, but we really don't think this is material to our investors. You don't have to put it in the 10K or the proxy statement. You can put it into a sustainability report or a CSR report, but it has to be accessible, put out a little publicity, make sure everyone knows that's where you're putting these disclosures so that you can get credit for the things that you're doing. And one of the kind of indicators of whether or not people are seeing it is whether it's getting picked up in those ratings or rankings. I would also note that it can be overwhelming. Companies, what I hear from clients is they're getting questionnaires, from all different sides. There's all these different rankings and ratings out there, and that's just too much to deal with. And so I'd say another sort of a way to winnow it down, way to figure out, okay, what should we be focusing on? Do we need to go and correct all of these different raters? Is to talk to your investors and figure out, what are they using the ISS rankings or ratings? Are they using something else? Figure out maybe one or two that are actually being used by your investors, and then make sure that they've got it right. Go through the process with maybe one or two of them to make sure that they are picking up all the disclosures you're putting out there. I think it's just a way to narrow down, because this ESG reporting can just be an overwhelming process. And so those are some of the things that companies can think about as they're going through this process. So Stephen, I'll turn it back over to you at that point.
No, thank you. I mean, thank you, Allison. Very helpful. We'll come back and get more about, some of the things that Callaway and Resman are doing on the reporting side and on that. So we'll come back to this topic. Meanwhile, Paul, perhaps you could talk, from the perspective of corporate social responsibility, especially as it relates to supply chain compliance, which is the area where you've been particularly active as an advisor in this area, both on anti-corruption and forced labor issues, and just your advice to clients in terms of ESG issues and regulatory and reputational risks. So, Paul.
Well, thank you, Stephen. So I would say that our group actually focuses on two main themes, like I said, the anti-corruption and also addressing forced labor, human trafficking, and supply chains, and then the myriad of issues that come alongside those things. But I will tell you, for myself personally, why I feel so strongly about this is I'd love to be able to rid the world of forced labor. There's 24.9 million people who right now are enslaved, this is just forced labor. Sex trafficking is something different, but 24.9 million people, that's the equivalent of everybody in 17 of our United States plus the District of Columbia. And to me, it's just such a horrible thing. So the fact that all of us on the call, all of us and all our friends could actually do something about it is such a great opportunity. I think the problem one of the problems we have is, from a corporate standpoint, our businesses, historically have been responsible for what we do within our operations. And now we see, hey, we're actually going to be held responsible. Our reputation is at risk, not because of something we do, but something that somebody up or down our supply chain does. So you may remember, it's been 8 years back, April 2013, where the Rana Plaza in Bangladesh, it collapsed. There were over 1,100 people were killed and 2,500 people injured. And, nobody knew what those little companies were in this big building. But yet when they go through the rubble, they found so many of the brands that we wear, so many of the stores that we shop at, their product was being made there. And so you can see where, the idea that the reason for this whole race to the bottom, lowest cost, we need to get things cheap as possible. It creates this economic dynamic where we end up in very dangerous situations. And then again, the companies, they had no idea that their product was being actually made in these places. So there's a lot to be done with our supply chains. I would say, we have Sarah and Mike. We see, these are A students. For those of you who are just enrolling in school, I get a lot of companies who are not public companies. They're just starting, hey, what do I do? So I think Kevin and Allison touched on this a little bit, but I always boiled down to 5 kind of steps, right? So first, get the champions, get senior management who will do the messaging for the company so that you get buy-in all the way down your rank and file. Then put together a team. Number 2, right? Compliance, bring in HR. Of course, the lawyers are important. Get people in procurement. And I think Kevin will touch on this later that, you got to bring in marketing, necessary evil. Keep your friends close, the rest of that. So identify weaknesses. Allison touched on this, where look at what problems that are in the industry, look at what problems you've had, maybe your company itself, see where we could identify places to shore up, and then take inventory. what can we do from, looking at current ESG activities, where are their gaps? And lastly, establish a timeline with measurable goals. Being able to say, okay, we've accomplished this, we've accomplished that, see where your progress is. And as Kevin says before, do it again, keep going around and around, and progress. So for those of you just starting out, take heart that you could do a lot. All right, Stephen, that's my 2 cents.
No, but I think going back to where you started, it sounds like that inventory is a pretty broad inventory that really does have to be pervasive across all different aspects of the operation and supply chain and all of that kind of stuff. That's a pretty substantial process, which I assume you'll be able to talk about a little bit more later. Okay, again, I want to invite people to post some questions in the chat room. Because we're going into where I hope we'll have among our panelists, as well as among those of you who are participating, a discussion of some of the challenges in ESG and some of the goals and get some answers to your questions and some practical tips. Let's get back to Mike and Sarah a little bit and ask them, some of the more specifics about, their companies and their industries. And Mike, let's start with you. You're in, you're the general counsel at a highly regulated company, ResMed, and ESG issues are coming at a time that you've sort of been in the process of this transformation of ResMed in terms of how the company thinks of itself, from being a device company to a data company, and all the issues that come with that. So I wonder if you could talk about some of the challenges that you face, and also how you talked about earlier about positioning yourself to what you see as taking some of the competitive advantages of being a leader in the ESG area. So.
Thank you, Stephen. So, from my perspective, the way I got involved with ESG is a direct result of our engagement with the Department of Justice and the Office of the Inspector General when we resolved an investigation, that was initiated by them a couple of years ago. And our CEO is very fond of saying that compliance is part of our company's DNA. But the hard lesson we learned as a result of that experience, it can be in your DNA, but you have to be able to prove it. And as a result of our settlement agreement with the Department of Justice and our corporate integrity agreement that we entered into as a result of that, we now have a world-class compliance program. And more importantly than that, it's not only in our DNA, but it's talked about at all levels of the company, from the CEO all the way down to every salesperson that's interacting with our customers day to day, so that compliance issues are now not an afterthought. They are what we do day in and day out. So, in terms of ESG and how that translates into ESG, the ESG report is where you get to tell your story with respect to compliance, and you get to tell it in a way that makes sense to your shareholders, makes sense to your stakeholders, and makes sense to the people that follow your company, the analysts and others who are interested in what we're doing. And I thought our experience, again, with the DOJ and our corporate integrity agreement was instructive, because rather than burying it in page 77 of a 100-page report, it is in our CEO's letter introducing our ESG report. So rather than run away from it, we embraced it. And now I, as the deputy general counsel, I'm not general counsel, Stephen, so don't get Pendarvis mad at me. But, as the lawyer who gives advice to our sales team in the United States day in and day out, I can now be confident that our compliance team members are making sure that that sales team is following the advice and we can prove it. That's the great thing about having a really robust compliance program and documenting it and telling your story in your ESG report. Hopefully that's responsive, Stephen.
No, that's really terrific, Mike. And what you're talking about is something which, you've talked about it. It's pervasive through the company. From the CEO, down to the sales agents out in the field. It can't have been easy in terms. I assume that there are aspects of resistance in that process. Anything there you'd want to, advise people on?
So look, I think you have an opportunity. When you face the kind of situation we face, you can face it one of two ways. You can either say, yeah, that's just the government telling us what we've got to do. Or you can embrace it and say, this is an opportunity to improve and to make it a competitive advantage. And I think our team absolutely embraced it, 100%. And the evidence of that, of the fact that it's been embraced, is we hear about compliance issues involving our competitors or our customers or the marketplace from our sales team. It's not the lawyers and the compliance team going out and looking for stuff that we need to solve. It's our own teammates saying, hey, this is an issue. How do we address it? How can we be better? Or how can we respond competitively when our competitors are not doing it better? And that to me means that, demonstrates most vividly that the company's embraced it and is living it day in and day out. That and the fact that it's migrated from the United States into all of our operations around the world, so that people that lead other countries are saying, what can we learn from your program that we can implement in our programs? That to me is the evidence that the people have really embraced it.
Thank you, Mike. I think as you heard earlier from Paul, we have the A students here. Sarah, Mike has talked about how we've been featuring it in the CEO letter, and Callaway's really been a leader here. If I recall correctly, your disclosure in your proxy for the 2019 year that came out in 2020 won the Donnelly Award for ESG disclosure. You've really been a leader here. So maybe you could talk about, what you see as some of the factors in Callaway's success in terms of addressing the issues you referenced earlier, in terms of not being where you wanted to be and going from there to really being in a position of leadership. And then what you see as the challenges of being able to stay at the head of the pack, which is where you've said you want to be.
Sure. I just to kind of clarify on the Donnelly, it's not really an award, but I think it's worth mentioning that what the process we have is, it was all kind of novel, right? It was something that we were doing, but we weren't disclosing in public filings like a 10K or a proxy statement. So I would say 2020 really was the year where we wanted to make a more robust disclosure in our proxy statement to reflect our kind of environmental and social processes. So we really vamped it up in 2020. And I think that was still where all the companies were kind of trying to figure out, what do we say and what do we, how do we frame this in our public filings? Like Allison was saying, it doesn't need to be in your 10K or your proxy statement as a public company. It could be on your website or your investor-facing IR website. But we chose the path of disclosing it in the proxy statement that year, and just compared to the prior year, it was just a much better disclosure, much better laid out. So Donnelly has this thing where they're one of the kind of prominent printer companies. Help a lot of companies process their proxy statement, and they just have this effective guide to proxy statements where they kind of have samples of model proxy statements they put together as a book for other companies to use this as kind of guidelines and samples. during the proxy season. So, and we were chosen as one of the good disclosures for purposes of I guess best in class disclosures for sustainability for 2020. So that's like what Stephen was mentioning, which for us was to be something really proud of, because before then we weren't really saying much. Now we were getting recognized by industry peers as saying, hey, Callaway's doing a great job making some really good disclosures about their processes in place and where do they see going into the future. So just wanted to elaborate on that a little bit. And stepping back a little bit as to the whole entire journey to date for Callaway, it's like several panelists have said, it's overwhelming. This is a lot, and there's a lot to think about. There's a lot to do, especially if you're a global organization. How do you kind of tackle this? So maybe I can spend a few minutes just sharing what Callaway has done to date. And then hopefully that can give you at least some maybe ideas on where to start the conversation and look into things. So looking back to kind of 2019, when we were first getting our ISS scores, and that was the topic of conversation, I think Mike said this, it comes from top down. If you really need your senior management and your board to embrace this topic of being committed to ESG efforts. And I think when the top down, there's a commitment as an organization to do the right thing. I mean, we talk about ISS, we talk about MSCI, we talk about other external sources ranking you. And that's a peer-reviewed way of looking at kind of where your organization stands against other companies and how you compare to them. But at the end of the day, this is about doing the right thing as a company and making sure that you share with the world what you're doing that is the right thing that you're doing as a corporation. So, when you have the commitment from the board and, they have a stake in this and they care a lot about it, as I believe our board does, and our senior management cares very much, because our executive sustainability committee is comprised of our CEO and his direct reports. That tone sets a very good example for the rest of the company, saying that this is an important topic that the company has embraced in its entirety as part of who we are. And with that, there was the launching of the sustainability initiative. And with that, you identify key stakeholders and what we call champions throughout the organization. And each of the stakeholders in various major subsidiaries to operations, HR, IT, marketing, I think Paul mentioned marketing, IR, legal, they all kind of came together, and we hold these meetings to identify some of the smaller projects for environmental and social causes that are brought upon even at, maybe employee idea, like get rid of water bottles, stop drinking plastic water bottles in the offices, all the way to having a major global wide initiative that kind of spans all of the subsidiaries and the entire organization in its entirety. And then we have these task kind of lists that have been formed where the stakeholders keep updated all the projects that are going on that are ESG related. Then we have presentations quarterly to the Executive Sustainability Committee to give them an update on what's going on as far as progresses that are being made throughout the organization. Then in turn, on an annual basis, we report to the board of directors on the big sustainability initiative program update, so that all of our board of directors are engaged and they are well informed, and that they can share their perspective on and give guidance on how the company should be thinking about ESG matters. So we have a lot of engagement happening, and naturally together with that, we also got a lot of engagement coming from investors. In the last couple of years, I've seen an uptick in our biggest shareholders reaching out to us and wanting to have calls, investor calls, just on ESG matters. And they're happy to hear our initiatives and our efforts, and they're happy to see the improvements that we're making. And I think it's a great way to engage with your investors. And then on the flip side, we have these sustainability newsletters that are going out to our employees, so they feel engaged. They feel like their ideas are not ignored, and they're part of the process of making this thing better, and then to go from kind of where we are now to improve it for the future. Now we're looking at things like rolling out a company-wide that includes company employees, suppliers, customers, board members, and investors on doing a materiality assessment survey to get their input on what is important from a sustainability perspective, from each of their perspectives. And then we see and we plot and kind of map out, how do we prioritize these abundance of sustainability topics that are at the forefront of every company's agenda. How do we organize this, process through this, and prioritize accordingly? That is going on now. And then our next step will also be retaining partners that can help us with the kind of the ESG reporting, better ESG reporting and ESG reports. So we're now working on that front. So I've said a lot, but I was just trying to kind of show you the journey we've gone through in the last couple of years, that to show that it can't be done overnight, but it is kind of a systematic process that with the right engagement from the board and the senior management and the company employees, you can really engage, your customers, your investors, and also, the regulatory bodies to an extent. And, that it is a process that grows and continues to evolve and develop. So start with identifying what you're doing within the company, and then, it can be overwhelming, but it can be a process step that is manageable for, I think, any organization if you kind of do it in a systematic manner with the right buy-in from the right stakeholders. So,
Sarah,
back to you, Stephen.
that was terrific. I mean, thanks for that overview and that journey. And I mean, the other thing worth noting is that in the midst of all of this, I mean, Callaway has done some major acquisitions. And so when you talk about the company, as you referenced earlier, I mean, you did say it's global and it's across subsidiaries and new subsidiaries, in Europe and major acquisitions like Topgolf in the United States. So, I might ask you to comment a little bit about that and the impact on that and how that's, impacted the process. But then I want to say we have about 10 minutes left. And so any questions, please do, I ask people contributing to put them in the chat room. And then I'm going to ask this question and then give the panelists a chance to ask questions back and forth, and then perhaps some final tips. So Sarah, just in response to that, I mean, the Wolfskin acquisition in Europe and then the Topgolf acquisition here. So it's an evolving company with new subsidiaries. So tell us a little bit about that and its impact on the process you've gone through.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a really great question. So we bought Jack Wolfskin right at the beginning of 2019. And the great thing about that is that Europe is, I think, kind of ahead of US in sustainability matters. And we had more to learn from Jack Wolfskin than what we were doing in the States. So by acquiring Jack Wolfskin and being able to see kind of their sustainability, really robust sustainability processes and the sophistication that they've already had in place, we could certainly leverage that knowledge and then incorporate it into our processes and learn from that. And also it allows you to kind of leverage what they're doing and then see if that makes sense to incorporate on your side. So just by having a global program in place and initiating the dialogue, it really allowed us to learn the best practices of different subsidiaries and kind of different regions of the world. And then with our latest acquisition of Topgolf, they were beginning their sustainability process journey. And then we could take kind of what we learned from it and also incorporate that process and integrate that right along with the regular integration process that happens in a big M&A. And it just felt so much more streamlined and, just part of the way we do business. So, obviously it's going to take a lot of work to get through all the kind of the aspects, various facets of what an ESG program means for different organizations. I think Allison mentioned this. It's not the same for every company. Every company is different, and even if we acquire them, they have kind of a different journey that they're going to walk. But knowing that there's a process in place and having that open communication really helps you to kind of learn from each other's best practices and being able to leverage that kind of across the board.
Thank you, Sarah. So, panelists, questions for each other you want to ask?
Well, Stephen, I would just chime in with, I think it's important to realize there is going to be naysayers,
Right.
and there are going to be people challenging. I think this group, where I think we are sort of talking to folks who are engaged and ahead of the curve, as you said, but there's going to be naysayers, and they're going to ask, is this truly good for my bottom line? They're going to look at that. Does this really drive investment, et cetera? So I think we need to be prepared to answer that and do so in an honest but broad way that is probably more accurate. And so, for example, return on sustainable investment is a measurement. I think it's the NYU school has, the Stern School has put that together. That's very useful. So think of your own way that you're going to measure. We talk about measuring your progress, but also part of that measurement is what is that return on your investment in a way that you can articulate to folks to answer those questions. So I think, we need to be clear about that and prepared for that.
Thank you, Kevin. So just, I'm going to, before we run out of time, the password for CLE credit is regulatory. So regulatory for CLE credit. I did get one question in the chat box, and I will read it. Are there any additional resources outside SASB that are recommended to help outline how to report on ESG? And how do you set ESG quantitative goals for your organization? Allison, you want to take up the first part of that, perhaps, and then we can ask Mike and Sarah.
Sure. I mean, I think, there are quite a few different reporting frameworks. I think others that we've heard about today include the TCFD, as well as, some of the international, Kevin, I'm going to butcher
the IBC, yep.
Yeah,
the International Business Council.
Yeah, IBC is another one. I think there, depending on what you're looking to do, there are a number of different sort of frameworks that you can think about. One of the reasons I mentioned SASB is because of it's got the industry guides, and so as a starting point, if you're thinking, okay, for our company, what are the things that might be relevant or material to our investors? I think that's a nice place to start because it is a little bit more tailored by industry. But GRI is one that's used by a lot of companies. The Carbon Disclosure Project is something that you can sort of opt in to decide to report under that framework and be sort of ranked or be part of that process. So there are a lot of different ones out there. And it can, like we said, it can be overwhelming. So sometimes it's just helpful to start and think, okay, maybe TCFD and SASB, that's where we're going to start, or GRI, that's where we're going to start. And it, picking, what makes sense. And as I mentioned, talk to a couple of your largest institutional investors and what's important to them. What are they looking for from your company? That can also help guide you in a direction that might be sort of most material, most relevant to your company.
So I guess we just have a couple of minutes, and maybe I will just then ask for any final tips from any of our panelists, just words of advice or warning or caution or.
I think from our perspective, there's a lot of people that will offer to help a company, get better at this exercise. And I think you have to figure out where true north is for the company and stay true to true north and measure yourself, and then decide whether you can make those measurements available to others. And So for us, we use GRI, and we've got a history of using the GRI as our standard. And we just keep track of where we are against it so that we can see if we're improving, or if we're not improving, now we know where we need to improve. And I think there's as many standards as there are people that are willing to help you. You know, if they still have Peter Ferrollo listed as the CEO of my company, I know that they're not really staying up to date on ResMed. But you know, I think you have to really pay attention to the, you know, the institutional services that your shareholders pay attention to. Thanks, Stephen. And thanks to Perkins Coie, and thanks to ACC for having us.
Well, thank you, Mike. Other final tips? Thoughts? Sarah?
One practical tip I would share is, I think it's important to get your senior management board's buy-in, as like I mentioned. But I think it's also really helpful if you have in your company like a designated project manager or somebody who's kind of accountable for sustainability, because that person can really centralize the process and have kind of a very streamlined process that gets implemented throughout the organization, instead of trying to divvy it up and have a whole bunch of people do it. At least in our organization, that's been very effective, and having a very outstanding project manager in place has been very, very helpful. So, and thank you from my perspective as well to
thank you, Sarah.
Perkins Coie.
Kevin, Paul?
I think it's important to promote and market the way Sarah and Mike have articulated, and you need to be cautious about just you know, going to somebody to help hype and do glossy color photos. It's got to be real. It's almost worse to have that paper tiger or artificially sugar coated ESG. Do it the real way, and don't be sort of lulled into thinking it's for show.
So Kevin's saying don't create legal exposure for your company. I would also say that, you know, when it comes to supply chain compliance, this may be a good opportunity for your organizations to really evaluate what's happened because of the pandemic. Just the disruption in supply chains has caused so many problems, and a lot of the corruption and the trafficking and so forth has really become exaggerated just because of the desperation people have felt, both workers and, you know, bad people.
Well, Jennifer, at this point, do I turn this back over to you and thank ACC? Any final words from you?
Well, thank you to our panel, to all of you for speaking today. I think this has been really excellent and helpful for all of us, and just appreciate it. Hope you all have a great day. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you.
All right.